This presentation is about the CEWASTE assurance and verification system for the certification of waste management operators against requirements focused on critical raw materials. The assurance and verification system have been developed as part of the CEWASTE project, a project on the voluntary certification scheme for waste treatment, which has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. The main objective of the CEWASTE project is to develop and validate a voluntary certification scheme for the collection, transport, and treatment facilities of key types of waste containing significant amounts of valuable and critical raw materials. This project has been initiated in response to a number of challenges: the need for sustainable access to valuable and critical raw materials, first of all, for the EU economy, the understanding that critical raw materials, or basically how they are processed in the waste phase, is currently not circular in Europe. The understandings in relation to the issue of illegal trade of waste, the need for standardization activities in support of various policy actions, and the need to support the development of environmentally and socially sound recycling systems globally. The approach of the project basically has a few stages or a few levels. In the beginning, we try to understand the existing recovery practices, the various standards and verification schemes that are related to valuable and critical raw materials. On this basis, the next step was to leverage basically the existing normative requirements as part of the development of new requirements for CRM recycling. We then developed an assurance system and related verification procedures, which I will present basically in the next slides. The next stage, which we are just beginning basically, is the validation of both the requirements and the assurance and related verification procedures. And this will be done through a set of pilots. And afterwards, basically, the idea will be to ensure the long-term sustainability of the scheme, resulting in a roadmap, and furthermore ensure a transparent stakeholder process that allows basically for a broad acceptance and dissemination of the essentials of the scheme. In terms of the project resources, the CEWASTE project was initiated basically with a duration of 2 years, funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program. In light of the corona pandemic, we have received an extension of 6 months. So basically, we assume basically that the project shall conclude sometime mid-2021. In the project, a strong consortiums of various partners are involved. We have basically 9 various consortium partners, and we have furthermore various linked third parties and an advisory board, which are also involved throughout the project. As for myself, my name is Yifaat. In the CEWASTE project, I'm leading the development of the assurance and verification system. I've been working at the Oeko-Institut from 2012, which is involved in the project, with some of my main research fields being the interface between chemicals, products, and waste legislation. In that respect, I've been working a lot basically in the ROS directive, the ELV directive, and on the batteries directive. And through this, basically, I have quite a lot of experience as to the various products and equipment and the use of various materials and substances therein. And this has been relevant basically in the case of the project. As for some general background, the project first looked at the current situation of CRMs contained in products and basically at the feasibility of their recovery from waste. And at various requirements that were already established in existing standards that would support or that do support basically the recycling of CRMs and of valuable materials. On this basis, a set of requirements was developed for actors of EEE and of battery waste management. Both of these 2 stages basically are documented in 2 other presentations that are being held as part of the Electronic Goes Green conference. So you can look for more information there. In terms of the assurance and verification scheme, these were developed in order to provide the framework for the certification and the compliance of the waste management value chain against the CEWASTE requirements. The assurance system basically specified the rules and procedures to be followed by various actors which are involved in the implementation of the scheme, whereas on the other hand, the verification system has been developed in order to support this process, and basically has developed various tools to support basically the assurance scheme, including basically tools for the auditing of facilities against the CEWASTE requirements, and basically for preparations of operators and auditors basically for these audits. The development of the assurance system required determining what processes it shall address, auditing, the audit assessment, the general scheme rules, and how basically these various processes were to be performed, and what kind of tools or guidance would basically aid these different processes. As a first step, the various principles addressed in ISO 17000 and the ISEAL Assurance Code of Good Practice were consulted to ensure the assurance scheme would be in line with such frameworks. At least in regard to consistency, rigor, competence, impartiality, transparency, and accessibility. In terms of ISO IEC 17067 on conformity assessment, clause 651 basically specifies various elements that need to be included in a scheme, and these were considered a little bit basically in the development of the assurance and verification scheme, be it the definition of the scope for the scheme, requirements for certification for operators, which were, again, are presented in one of the other presentations by a colleague of mine, requirements for the certification of bodies, various methods and procedures and related aspects basically for the certification process, and also the resources that are required for operating the scheme, operating audits, etc. We also looked at the ISEAL Assurance Code, which specifies normative requirements for implementing an assurance system for assessing conformity with sustainability standards and related chain of custody standards. Here, guiding principles for the system development were also looked into. For example, the need for the system to be sustainable, to include references basically to continuous improvement, relevance, rigor, engagement of stakeholders, impartiality, for example, of the various auditors that perform the various processes, transparency of the system itself, accessibility of the system to various actors and users, truthfulness, and efficiency. In terms of the CEWASTE scheme in general and the assurance system, the scheme is basically being developed as a voluntary third-party certification scheme. The objective is to contribute to the recovery of critical raw materials from key types of waste, components of WEEE and of ELVs. The framework for the assurance system has been developed, specifying the rules and procedures to be followed. For example, how the CEWASTE scheme is organized, who makes what type of decisions, who needs to be involved in such decisions, various rules for the certification bodies and for auditors in terms of how audits are to be assessed, how decisions on certification are to be made, how the approach used by various auditors is to be harmonized in order to ensure basically a harmonized implementation. This also includes rules as to the eligibility of individuals and or organizations acting under certain roles. So, for example, individuals that would like to be auditors or that would like to be part of the management board members, and on the other hand, also certification bodies that would like to participate in the scheme and certify basically against the requirements. It also includes rules for the updating and the maintenance of the scheme rules and of the scheme requirements, and basically specifies how often this needs to take place, and also what kinds of developments in policy basically would initiate an update. To ensure the conformity of various facilities, wastes, operators with the CEWASTE requirements, the assurance system basically operates on 3 levels or in 3 different processes. We first of all have the scheme rules themselves, the framework basically for the functioning of the certification scheme and of the waste certification bodies. Then on the second level, there is the scheme processes, basically the rules and the templates and the guidance that has been developed in order to support the auditing of facilities in the course of CEWASTE certification. And then we have assessment in relation to the scheme, basically the rules and templates and guidances for supporting the review of audit results and basically the decisions on certification. The CEWASTE scheme is applicable to the processes of collection, transport, treatment of waste electrical and electronic equipment, and waste batteries. The general scope of the scheme is defined in the CEWASTE certification requirements, basically the requirements against which conformity of operators is to be assessed. The scope of a specific certification is based on two different dimensions. On the one side, on the type of facility being certified, and on the other side, on the waste fraction being handled. Their certification process is described in detail, referring to the application for certification, its performance in terms of the audit, the assessment, and the decision as to the conformity and certification. As for the CEWASTE verification system, again, the system that supports basically the scheme and its implementation, this system has been developed in order to support the processes addressed in the scheme rules, the assurance system. In terms of inspiration, we looked a little bit at existing verification systems of e-waste management facilities, and raw material certification systems were also analyzed, such as Wheelabex and the SWICO schemes. Such systems particularly inspired the approaches adapted for verification of the CEWASTE requirements, particularly in relation to the Senelec requirements included in the CEWASTE standard. Experience of auditors that are part of the CEWASTE team was also taken into consideration for deciding on specific aspects of the tools developed in the system. And later on, we expect basically to have an additional update after the pilots take place, which will also allow us basically to make some fine-tuning based on the experience with the verification system. The CEWASTE verification system basically includes various templates and tools or guidance that have been developed in order to support the various procedures developed as part of the assurance system. Each of these tools or templates is relevant to a different stage basically of the certification process and addresses various aspects of relevance at that stage and also actors basically involved in that stage. Basically, in terms of the various tools and guidances that have been developed, this goes through the first stage basically of the application for certification, through the planning of the audit, its performance, and then basically the assessment of the audit and certification. In terms of the tools that have been developed to support the verification system, the auditing and assessment of operators applying for the CEWASTE certification includes, on the one side, certain documents, such as the CEWASTE audit plan template, which is used by auditors and operators for planning and coordinating audits. And then there is the CEWASTE audit report template used by auditors for the documentation of the audit assessment. This is then accompanied by what we call a kind of Excel checklist tool, which includes 3 different parts. Currently, this is developed as a single tool, but it will later be separated into 2 parts. There is an auditing checklist, which supports basically auditors in the assessment of operator compliance with the CEWASTE requirements. For the use of auditors, we also have the verification manual, which provides guidance on assessing conformity of the requirements. That is on the assessment being performed in a harmonized way by auditors. The third part, which will later be separated basically into an independent part, is kind of an assurance manual, which provides guidance to operators on how to prepare basically for the audits. The checklist tool has been devised as a working instrument for supporting the auditing procedure, both for the auditor and the operator. Currently, it is a single tool, but we will separate it later basically into 2 separate tools. It includes questions and text that allow basically for the preparation and for the performance of the assessment of each requirement. It includes various filtering options that allow making the tool more fit for purpose, basically by allowing filtering to make it fit for the auditing of a specific facility or a specific fraction of waste. There is also some introductory information, and various annex text have been integrated into the tool in order to provide additional background basically for auditors and operators using it. There is the specification of the various requirements, the CEWASTE requirements, as either high relevance or as other, which basically allows an easier identification of areas where nonconformance will be understood basically as a major nonconformity. And an assessment sheet is also included that summarizes the nonconformities identified by the auditor, which is basically to support the final assessment and the decision as to certification. I was hoping to present the Excel tool and to really show you how it works, but I didn't get basically how to do that in video, so I've taken some snapshots and will try to explain a little bit. In terms of the filtering options, what you see here is basically part of the questions that have been developed in relation to management requirements, and you see basically that you have different options to filter in relation to the operator, the type of the we that it is addressed, the audit scope. Then basically, in general, you always have the reference to the CEWASTE requirement, the number of the clause, the title of the clause, and then you have basically the requirement itself. This is followed basically by audit questions, which have been developed basically for each requirement or for each part of the various clauses, and gives basically an option for the auditor to document the answer to the various questions. So this is kind of the checklist part of it that allows the actual performance of the audit. Then on the other side of the same sheet, we basically have additional information, what we call the manuals. There is a verification manual for auditors and an assurance manual for operators. And in relation to each of the requirements, basically each of the separate parts of the various clauses that appear in the requirement document, we have added, where we saw it to be relevant, additional information that should support both the auditors and the operators in terms of a better understanding of the requirements and how to consider basically if they are fulfilled or not. So this basically on the one side supports for both of these actors the preparation of the audit, and for the auditor it also gives kind of a database where you can go and check specific aspects in order to be sure if the facility you are auditing is compliant or not. The assessment sheet then basically allows a documentation of the nonconformities. It provides place basically for the auditor to fill in the general details of the specific audit, and then basically to detail the various nonconformities that have been identified. And in this sense, basically in one place, there is a compilation of the various nonconformities, which should support basically reaching a decision as to if the facility should be certified or not. There's also a short explanation as a reminder for the auditor, basically how the assessment works. And finally, there is various background information that has been included into the checklist in various sheets, really general background information as to the CEWASTE project and requirements. Then we have basically one of the annexes from, or some of the annexes actually from the document, from the requirement document. For example, the list of critical raw materials, products, and components that are targeted basically by the CEWASTE requirements. We also have included from the same document the various flows of the system, which basically also give detail of the various requirements that are relevant at each stage of the value chain. So this is also basically different tools that support basically the process of auditing. In terms of the outlook for the project, the current version of the templates and the tools is a work in progress. The CEWASTE requirements and the tools and templates are still to undergo a pilot phase, where through auditing to be performed at EEE and battery waste operators, it will be able to check basically what works and what doesn't work. We also expect basically to have another consultation with stakeholders as part of the process. And finally, both the assurance system and the verification system shall undergo a kind of final fine-tuning and revision, both in relation to things that we understand are still not sufficient through the pilot, or aspects raised by stakeholders. And finally, also in alignment with the revisions still to be made basically in the CEWASTE requirements. And with that, I would like to conclude the presentation and to thank you for listening.